Andrew. Thanks so much for joining me today on the Wineitupanotch podcast. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Anshu. Thank you for having me.
For those who wouldn't necessarily know, we met when I went to a trade event and tasted your portfolio of wines. And I thought to myself, this is a really important producer and a great set of wines that I really want to bring to my audience. So I'm really glad that we were able to make that happen. And without further ado, I will just share that you are the regional manager for Ontario, Canada for all of Masi.
You got it right. I prefer Masi guy in Ontario, but I think that's what's on my business card, which is like a little bit close to the assistant to the regional manager joke from the office, which I like to make sometimes. But yeah, regional manager for Ontario. And I have a boss who looks after all of Canada who's based out of Quebec.
Now, you'd
Yeah.
have to, if you're a wine lover, be living under a rock to not know Masi. It's such a huge name. But before we start talking about Masi, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself, Andrew.
Sure. Born in Toronto. My father was in the wine business, as was his father and his father before him. So I guess that makes me fourth generation, but fell into it a little later on. Went to university for history of science and economics. Very boring, at least the economics part. And then worked in film and photography in my 20s, and then was looking for a career change, and wine seemed a natural place to go from there. I started taking some courses, first at IWEG where we met, and then did my certified sommelier as well, and to the US for a certified wine educator course as well. And actually just got back into the education and did Italian wine scholar. And then, yeah, first worked for a small consignment agency for a little while in Toronto, did some time in Prince Edward County, getting my hands dirty in a winery, and then was at another larger consignment agency. And then have been a Masi for about 7 years now.
Amazing. So you've
Yeah.
got cradle to grave, all the experience.
I guess so. Yeah. I trying to make up for a bit of lost time. If I could do it all over again, I think winemaking would be a very cool route, but got a young family. It'd be hard to drag them around the world to get the experience and to do that. But all the respect in the world to winemakers and the people that are growing the grapes, which is fascinating. And that's the most important step of the whole process. And I just get to show these beautiful wines to people and try to tell the stories as best I can and get to drink them every once in a while too.
As I say, life is long, so there's still opportunity, I think, for you to
True. Very true. Very true.
do what you want to do. And you do tell the stories really well. So why don't we get right into it? How about you tell me a
Okay.
little bit about Masi?
So Masi is a Venetian producer. So Venetian from Veneto province in northeast Italy. But as we'll get into, I'm sure some projects a little outside of that as well. Family owned company. Last year was a big year. It was the 250th anniversary of the first vintage in the history of the Boscaini family, who are the family behind the Masi brand. The name Masi actually comes from the name of the first vineyard that the Boscaini family harvested, little vineyard called the Valle de Masi, the little valley of Masi, in the heart of Valpolicella Classica. It goes back a ways. Certainly some Italian families with longer history, but for us here in Canada, it's yeah, quite exceptional now into the ninth generation of Boscaini. So Sandro Boscaini, president of Masi, an absolute legend, also known as Mr. Amarone, traveled quite a bit to the market in the 90s, grew Masi from really a drop in the bucket to one of the leading premium Italian wine suppliers across Canada. And I think really interesting in not just building the profile of Masi, but the Veneto as a whole. I don't know if you've been to any big wine shops in the States lately, but the first time I went in there after starting to work with these wines, I was very surprised by the lack of space given to the Veneto section compared with the LCBO or the SAQ, in which Veneto is, if not the leader, it certainly gets as much shelf space as Tuscany and more than Piedmont. So I think a big part of that is Sandro's efforts in the market in the 90s, making many trips here, spreading the word and sharing these beautiful wines with people. And now he's doing a little less traveling, but his son and daughter involved with the company, and his daughter Alessandro's son is working for Masi, and he has a son named Sandro who represents the ninth generation of Boscaini. A wonderful family story. And yeah, it's like you said, a well-known name in Canada. Many people are surprised to know that 30% roughly of Masi's production is sold in Canada. So Masi exports to over 100 countries worldwide, but Canada is the primary export market in terms of volume. That's why I have my job, and we're very grateful to be in the position we are with the LCBO and the people of Ontario and Canada who seem to really enjoy the wines.
That's so interesting. I have to say, I didn't really realize that we were one of the biggest markets for Masi in terms of export.
Absolutely. And I'm sure the Italian diaspora has something to do with that. I love to meet older Italian, usually gentlemen who like to tell me about their homemade wines, but they begrudgingly admit after a few minutes that when I run out of my homemade wines, I buy mad sometimes. Or like I'm like, yeah, at Christmas time, we have Masi on the table. So I think there's no better seal of approval than hearing that from somebody who's from the old country and get their hands dirty every fall with grapes that are shipped from California or whatever.
Well, you said a couple things I think I want to zero in on. So, one, I have to say, again, maybe because of the prominence with which I've seen the Masi product here in Ontario and Canada, I would not have thought it was a family owned company. So, that's really interesting because
Yeah.
it's a large company with lots of products on offer, and it's beautiful to know that it's, 9 generations in now, so you're really supporting a family company if you're drinking Masi. You also mentioned, Mr. Amarone, so I think that's
Mhm.
a nice entrant into the product line, and you talked a little bit about the Veneto, so maybe you could just tell us a little bit about Masi's fairly substantial product line.
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot of branches on the tree. Let's start with the core range. Like you mentioned, Amarone. Masi, first and foremost, sees itself as an Amarone producer. Make 5 different Amarones, which I believe is the most of any producer. And that's really the heart and soul of the company. Amarone and a Passamento, of course. Amarone being a wine made 100% from a Passamento. That's really the nuts and bolts. But from there, Campo Fiorine, which is another real pillar, the best-selling Masi wine worldwide, despite being far from the least expensive. Campo Fiorine was the original Ripasso on the market, the first Ripasso to be commercialized. First vintage 1964. Had the 50th anniversary of that a few years ago. No longer technically a Ripasso. It's now what we call a double fermentation wine. We can get into that a little bit later if you like, but important to mention, Ripasso, of course, now its own DOC. So we're no longer a Ripasso wine technically, but the LCBO categorizes us there. And for most consumers, it's a good touch point for them to understand Campo Fiorine, but there's certainly more to the story. And then Bonacosta is our Valpolicella Classico. So those 3 wines are all the exact same blend, Corvina, Rondinella, Molinaro, but differentiated in terms of the appassamento. So no appassamento for the Valpolicella. 100% of the grapes undergo appassamento for the Costa Serra, and a portion of the grapes undergo appassamento for the Campo Fiorine. So that's sort of the 3 heavy hitters, classic wines of the Valpolicella. We make some Bardolino, some Soave, some Lugana. You'll see much of that in Ontario at the moment. Of course, available for private order. And perhaps we'll get some interest from the LCBO down the road, but those are neighbors to Valpolicella. So important to mention. We make Masianco, a white wine made mostly from Pinot Grigio. So that's, let's say, the sort of the core range of the Masi products. You'll see on the shelf of the LCBO. We also have our Masi Modelo range, which is produced from a vineyard that we own just outside of the Veneto. So now into Friuli, Venezia Giulia, and Trentino Alto Adige. So we've got some stuff going on in each of those 3 regions in Northeast Italy. Back to the Masi Modelo, make a Merlot and a Pinot Grigio from that vineyard that's just outside of Veneto. The Masianco comes from there as well. It's actually another wine called Grandarella that's 100% Refosco that gets full of Passamento. From there, under also the Masi Modelo line, is our Prosecco. That is produced at a winery, Canavel, which Masi acquired 60% of in a joint venture back in 2016. So Canavel is another family-owned producer right in Valdobbiadene, the heart of Prosecco production historically. Very well regarded in Italy, but did not have much of an export footprint beyond that. So they entered the joint venture with Masi. So now Masi is in the Prosecco game, which a testament to Sandro. I think we could have been involved there earlier. purchasing some juice and slapping a Masi label on it. But for Sandro to have a foothold in the region was important before getting into the Prosecco game. The Masi Modelo Prosecco is brut, dry, delicious. And then I'll mention Argentina briefly.
Yes, please
Masi has
do.
a property called Masi Tupungato in the small town of Tupungato, which is located in the Uco Valley subregion of Mendoza. Uco Valley is an up and coming spot for premium Malbec production, but there we are working with not just Malbec, but also brought over some Corvina. So Masi was the first to plant Corvina in Argentina and working with some Pinot Grigio as well. So 3 wines produced there. We have our Paso Doble, which is mostly Malbec with a little bit of Corvina. The Corvina gets a short Passamento and then 2 are combined for a double fermentation. Paso Blanco, not currently in the Ontario market, but in Quebec, elsewhere in Canada. That's Pinot Grigio Torrontés. And then Corbec is sort of the top wine from the Masi Tupungato estate that is mostly Corvina and some Malbec, both of those getting a full Appassimento in the Amarone style. The humidity in Argentina is much lower than Italy, so the Appassimento is much shorter there. But beautiful wines from Argentina. Those are organically grown. The next piece of the puzzle I'll mention are what we call the historic Venetian estates. Masi partners with some historic estates, some noble families. The most well-known would be the Sorrego Alighieri family, the direct descendants of Dante Alighieri, the poet. Dante was expelled from Tuscany during his lifetime, ended up in Northeast Italy, spent some time in Verona, and his son purchased the property in 1353 that the family still lives on. So that's the Sorrego Alighieri estate, La Foresteria. If you ever make it to Masi, that's where you could stay. There's 10 rooms, property as you can imagine. Just what you'd picture if you're, daydreaming of a gorgeous Italian villa that's neighbors to Masi. But since the 70s, Masi has done the winemaking and the sales and marketing for the Sorrego Alighieri family and their historic vineyard holdings. And then one more I'll mention, the Bossi Pedregotti family, another noble family based north of Valpolicella in Trento. Similar to the joint venture with Sorrego Alighieri, Masi does the winemaking for the Bossi Pedregotti family and their historic vineyard holdings. So that was a very long answer to a short question, but hopefully that gives you an idea of all the different irons in the fire, so to speak.
And I think we might have missed one because I don't think you covered Tuscany.
Okay, yeah. So that newer Tuscan property is an extension of the Sorrego Alighieri project. So given that Dante was originally from Tuscany, his property was acquired there. More recently, we're making red in the Montecucco DOC as well as Vermentino, and those farmed organically as well. I gather it's gorgeous, just south of the river from Brunello di Montalcino. So hope to get there soon.
Sounds amazing. Now, I know you said that was a long answer to a short question, which maybe it was, but I think it's really important because it shows the depth and complexity of the portfolio. As you said, the irons in the fire. And also, I think speaks a little bit to just the background of some of the larger producers in Italy, where there are holdings across different parts of the country. And for someone who's maybe a little less familiar than you and I are on Italy, when you're talking about Veneto, we're really in the northeast part of the country there. And you talked about above the Veneto with Friuli, Venezia Giulia, Alto Adige. So we're sort of up north, we're over to the east. And then we're dropping down into Tuscany as well, a little bit more central, if you will. And then with Prosecco, quite a different area and style than the dry wines that we talked about. And you also covered a really broad range of grapes, some of them fairly well known, what we would call international grapes, and other grapes that are more indigenous in character.
Mhm.
And I remember when you and I tasted together in that group setting, when I came to the tasting that you were sharing the wines at, you had brought some barrel samples and you did this really great walkthrough of the indigenous grapes and what they were adding, or some of the less expected grapes, if you will, and how they contributed to the blend. Because when we're talking Valpolicella, and you mentioned this, there's 3 categories: Valpolicella basic, if you will, just for lack of a better
Sure.
way to put it, with no appassimento, and we should cover exactly what appassimento means. Valpolicella ripasso, which has, I would say, hung out with the appassimento style.
Exactly. Good way to put it.
And then we've got the Amarone, which is our full-fledged wine made utilizing the appassimento method. and it's a blend of 3 grapes. There's, I think, a lot that you've said there that for someone who's trying to understand wines better, there's a lot to unpack. Let's zero in on a passamento for a moment, and I won't explain it. I'd love to hear it from your perspective. Exactly what is a passamento and what does it add to the wine?
I think for the most part, when you talk about Policella, people are expecting a wine made from fresh grapes without a passamento. Okay, let's talk passamento, an ancient technique dating back to the Romans. It's a method of concentrating the grapes before fermentation. In the case of Valpolicella, the grapes are hand harvested in whole bunches, selected, not just any bunch, but bunches where we've got very healthy grapes, looking for some space in between the grapes for airflow during the appassamento. That's important. And if you look at the native grape varieties, they're well adapted for that. And in Valpolicella, these grapes hand harvested, laid into small wooden boxes, transported very carefully and drying along, where they're laid out on bamboo racks. But really think of it as like a cane that grows by the river. I'm not talking about the big giant bamboo poles, but smaller than your little finger, these round canes. So there's racks made with these canes that have some space in between them for airflow again. And the bunches are laid out on these bamboo racks. In the case of Amarone, for 90 plus days, at least at Masi. So up to 120 days in the case of our Reserva Costa Serra. So harvest typically happens late September, early October. In the DOC for Amarone, you only have to dry them till December 1st. But for Masi, that would be quite a short a passamento. It wouldn't get us to where we want to be. So for our Amarones, we're drying into January or even into February. So 3 to 4 months. And during that time, you're losing about 40% of the moisture that's in the grapes that concentrates everything that's inside. So your sugars relatively are going to go up because you've got less water. Your acids go up, but more so than a concentration, there's also a transformation of flavor. And a really interesting thing that I didn't know about until I started working on Masi was the botrytis or noble rot that also happens during this drying process, in particular with the Corvina grape. It has a little bit thinner skins, but that kicks in around 70 days into the appassamento. So back to that December 1st thing, if you're doing a faster appassamento, you're not going to necessarily hit that 70-day mark where you start seeing botrytis affecting Corvina grape primarily. So that's, I think, part of the secret sauce at Masi is a long, slow appassamento in a cooler environment. And, you can't rush these things. It's all about time and temperature. And so after 100 days, you have these grapes that are not totally looking like raisins, but pretty well on the way there. It takes about 2 kilograms of grapes to make a bottle of Amarone, whereas it takes about 1 kilo of grapes to make a conventional fresh wine. So part of the reason why it's the least expensive wine on the shelf. And then the result is really one of the great wines of Italy that you've got to taste to understand. And I think we're going to taste a little bit later here, but a big wine, 15+% alcohol, full bodied, but also with the approachability and sort of elegance, smooth, velvety texture that belies the high alcohol percentage and the size of the wine. So sometimes you hear people call it the gentle giant, which I think is a good name, or velvet glove over an iron fist, or one of those sort of analogies. Yeah, it's a huge wine, but at the same time, an approachable wine, and I think an easy wine to fall in love with. So that's the passamento for Amarone in a nutshell. You'll see this passamento process used all over the Mediterranean. Further south, often it happens outside when there's not as much concern about rains in the fall, and does get quite cool in Valpolicella in the fall. And I think if you think about it historically, sugar was not as available back 1,000, 2,000 years ago as it is today. Sweet things were prized. And so concentrating the grapes to make the most powerful wine you could, first to make really delicious. You can imagine eating one of those grapes after 100 days. It would just be super concentrated, super sweet. So the original, now I'm going down another path here, but the original form of Amarone was a wine called Recioto. And Recioto is actually a sweet red wine that underwent this passamento process. I think, for my money, the sweet wines are the most undervalued wines out there today because people are trying to have less sugar. Some of the very sweet wines have lots and lots of sugar if you look at grams per liter. But these were wines that were like the most prized wines for thousands of years, enjoyed in the courts of royalty all over. And now nobody wants to touch them with a 10-foot pole. That's my little spiel on sweet wines. But before modern winemaking technology and bottling and sanitary practices in the winery, the higher the alcohol percentage, the stronger the wine, the more likely it was going to last until the next vintage, the easier it would be to transport it a few hundred kilometers away. That's the origins of the technique. But now do a passamento because we like what it does to the wines. And it's a really fascinating technique to dive into and understand.
What does the botrytis add in terms of flavor when it comes to a red wine?
For me, it's more of an impact on the texture of the wine. Botrytis creates some compounds that sound scary, but like the glyconic acid, glycerol, which are
They
give
contribute to the body. Is that fair?
exactly. Yeah. The texture, that sort of velvety mouth coating texture, and also the impression of sweetness. Amarone is a dry wine. It drinks a little sweeter than it actually is. And I think that the botrytis is a big reason why.
Yeah, I was gonna say I liked your velvet glove analogy. I always talk about Amarone as a really big, beautiful, bold wine, but elegantly dressed, if you will. It's
For
not
sure.
going to clobber you by way of really obstructive tannins or really searing acidity. It's all there. The structure is there. Of course, it's a very well structured wine, but
Mhm.
it's pretty smooth as you're drinking it. And I don't know an Italian, I would say, who doesn't love
Yeah.
Amarone.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think it's a great entry point to the old world wines. Let's say you fell in love with California Cab or Napa Cab, as many people do. To go right to a Barolo or even a Brunello could be jarring, like the Italian reds, lots of tannin, lots of acid. As you said, Amarone certainly has the structure, but it has a sort of approachability and elegance that I think makes it a great gateway into Italian wines and maybe even old world wines in general. A great stepping stone into a little more tannin and acid and guts that
Very fair.
that the
Very
old
fair.
world wines have.
Now, we should talk then, just you've, I think, set this up beautifully about foods that pair really well
Hmm.
with the Masi wines. But let's focus in on Amarone since that's what we're talking about and that's what we'll be tasting in a moment. Before we do that, though, I just wanted to maybe ask you in terms of the Masi portfolio, and you've talked about a range of different wines. Is there, in your view, a must know, must try iconic wine?
I think you'd have to say Campo Fiorine, must try iconic wine that everybody should taste. A reference point for a Passamento, for the evolution of the Ripasso style, for Italy, the Veneto. But if we were to put that aside, assuming everybody's tried Campofurine and maybe more of like my personal favorites, sleeper picks, what I'm enjoying, it's a very fun portfolio to work with because there's everything from Prosecco since 2016, but a whole range of styles in Prosecco. In Trento, there's a Trento DOC from the Bossi Feddragotti estate called Conte Federico. Have you had Trento DOC wines?
I
We don't
actually
see them.
have.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
They're hard to find in Ontario. People that are doing some wine education, you often hear about Franciacorta as Italy's traditional method sparkling, but Trento DOC was not a wine that I was very familiar with until I tasted this Conte Federico, and that's aged 36 months on the lees. It's incredible complexity and yeah, beautiful wine. Most of that gets drank in Italy, given this Trento DOC is not widely known here. I think it would come in probably $40, $50, and that's getting into price of entry level champagne. So it's upsell, but one of my favorites to drink when I'm over there. We have a rosé that I love, Rosa de Masi, 100% Rofosco, and some of the Rofosco gets a little Passamento. The Bonacosta Valpolicella, a lot of the time, Bonacosta slightly chilled is what I'm after. Like you're
Lovely.
having Domino's with your kids on a Monday night. Bonacosta would be the wine for me there. And then one more I'll mention the Recchiotto, which I mentioned as the sort of historic precursor to Amarone. That's a wine that's really fun to show people the wonders of this. It's not super sweet, so it's can have some fun with the pairings with the Recchiotto. It's a really fun way to end a wine dinner, especially an Amarone dinner, to try the historic, sweeter version of it. So those are some, yeah, some of my favorites in the portfolio.
Absolutely. You know what? Actually, just behind me here in my office, I've got a Recchiotto, not a
Oh,
Mazzi
no way.
Recchiotto.
Okay.
Yeah, not a Mazzi, but I do have one and I'm hanging on to it for the right occasion. You said not
Very
that
cool.
sweet, but I think we're probably still hitting 160, 170 grams per liter.
There's actually a range of styles and sugar levels. Masi makes three that are all quite different in residual sugar. Some of them more 40, 50, one 70, and one closer to what you mentioned. But yeah, there's a range of
There's a
styles. And
range.
yeah, it'd be fun to do a comparative tasting. Imagine they purchased some other Reciotos. So maybe a little Recioto tasting closer to Christmas. And it's such a fun wine at Christmas because it's got those clove and cinnamon and those Christmassy spices that we love.
Whenever you're down, you know my number now. You call
All
me
righty.
and I will sit down and taste the portfolio with you. It's no problem.
Fantastic. We'll get you
You
some of our Recioto for sure.
You've got a partner in crime. Okay, so we are
Likewise.
gonna taste now. I've taken up a lot of your time and I wanna be respectful of it. So let's get to tasting, but before we do, or maybe as we do, you let me know what you'd like to do. Tell our listeners what they should be pairing. We're gonna focus in on Amarone. What should they
Okay.
pair Amarone with in your view?
Very good question. And there's a few different answers. I mean, it's a versatile wine. A lot of people think steak. Sure, absolutely. That works. You're going to find lots of great Amarones on the list at any steakhouse. So that's the first one that comes to mind for a lot of people. And I'd say absolutely, that's a no brainer. For me, my favorite pairings, one like a braised meat. So
Right?
maybe a braised beef over some polenta or even a lamb shank, just meats that are cooked low and slow that are very rich and need a wine with structure and acidity to pair. But maybe even more than the braised beef, I love it after dinner with gorgonzola.
Oh, yes.
My very favorite pairing. It's wine that you can take from a main course with protein into the after dinner. Vino di meditazione, which is a term that they love to teach us in these wine courses, a meditation wine. For me, that means a wine, you want a pretty big glass. This one's not too crazy. This is time to pull out your big, showy, giant Riedel or whatever you have. In my mind's eye, I have none of these things, but I'm imagining a big leather armchair, a fireplace, maybe a nice old dog curled up, and I'm pouring my Amarone into my giant glass, and I'm just going to take my time and swirl and enjoy the evolution of the wine in the glass with a little bit of gorgonzola, maybe some good Parmigiano Reggiano with a little honey, maybe some truffle honey if you want to get fancy. And that for me is my favorite way to enjoy Amarone.
You are literally speaking my language. So as I asked you the question, of course, I thought of my own answer in my mind, and I thought smoked brisket. I
Boom.
think it would be beautiful.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Smoked brisket,
That's
that was
funny. I had a
my
brisket sandwich yesterday.
yeah, that was my meat choice, especially with a nice like a
Yeah.
glaze or a barbecue sauce of sorts. But the alternative outside of that was literally on a colder day or just a day that you wanna hang out, you're
Yeah.
sitting down, you have a nice glass of wine, and you're just drinking it for the sake of drinking it. I think Amarone is a wine you can just drink and watch it unfold and
Yeah.
peel off all the layers. And actually, on this podcast, I've done an episode on meditation and wine, and
Oh,
I
cool.
talk there about the idea of being low and slow with your wines, like taking your time with them. And some wines lend themselves really well to that. Others, maybe not. They're meant to be drunk quickly and
All about
cold and
context. Yeah.
yeah,
It's,
or
I
even
think
some of our
all,
beautiful white wines that are just crisp and rosés, like they're fun to drink
mm,
and you're drinking them with your friends and you're enjoying the wine, but maybe not noticing it as much as some of our more richer wines like an Amarone, I think that you could spend time with and literally as you're eating different things or just drinking it over time, noticing how it's changing. So that's cool. We're on the same wavelength. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's taste. So I've got the bottle here.
okay.
Hopefully, we can see it for
That's
those
the
that will be
one.
watching this. And
That's,
we are
label has
tasting.
not changed much over the years.
Now, my background might make it hard for someone to see if they're
Yeah. It's
watching
kind of
this.
popping in and out.
So let's say what it is. And I was very excited. So for the listeners or the viewers, Andrew was kind enough to drop off a bottle for me in a beautiful box, actually. And we pulled up as a family to the front door. My kids said, "Oh, someone's left wine for you," which, does happen from time to time. And I said, "Okay, cool. I'll open it tomorrow before the podcast." And when I opened it, I was quite excited because we are having a 2016. So this is a treat for sure. And it's the Costa Serra Amarone Classico.
Yes. 16 was a really nice vintage. I should mention Masi does their own internal rating of the vintages that just came out of being forgotten by the major wine publications, or they would give a vintage rating to all of Italy as a whole, or give Veneto the same one as Tuscany and Piedmont. So Sandro decided, why don't we just give our own honest assessment of each of our vintages, which they do out of 5 stars. Those don't come along every year. In the last decade, 2012, 2015, 2018 were the 5 star vintages. But 2013 and 2016, I think, you know, 4.5, or certainly could have been 5 stars, but maybe the vintage prior got the 5 stars. And you got to be especially hard markers if you're marking yourself. So the 16, not a 5 star vintage. If it is, you'll see it on the label, just above the vintage, but I think easily it could have been an excellent vintage. And yeah, for a wine to buy off the shelf at the LCBO, I think it's pretty cool that we're able to offer something that's 7 years on. Usually there's about a 2 year spread in between the Bonacosta Valpolicella current vintage is 2021. The Campofurine just moved from 18 to 2019. And then the Serra Amarone, a little bit of 2016 kicking around, which what you have, but mostly now into the 2017 vintage. So you got the 2016, which is what I have as well. Beautiful vintage. Still very, I think, the early stage of its evolution. That's another thing Sandro has, I think, worked very hard to prove to the world that Amarone is a wine that absolutely can age 20, 30, 40 years, no problem. So still a baby, you could say, but it does have a few years of bottle age on it.
Yeah, and I have to say it's still smelling incredibly fresh. And I know I had asked you, Andrew, to take us through the tasting because I want the listener to hear from you, not from me. They're used to hearing from me, but
I'd like
beautiful
you
and
to do a proper W set assessment of it, because I've totally forgotten how to taste wine like that. But for me, it's now a little more just emotional than technical, I'd say, with my tasting.
all right, let's do it then in that case. So
In the glass, it's
definitely I would call it,
deep, intense. The funny I found that W said everything was ruby.
yes, of course.
Unless you're drinking like some ancient Rioja or something. I always
Well,
got in trouble for saying garnet, but I would say maybe a little garnet towards the rim.
so I was gonna say this is yeah, I was gonna say it's a deep ruby. It's
Deep.
definitely very deep, but and almost pushing purple in the core, but definitely around the outside it's starting to rim, right? Garnet on the rim for sure. So you can see a bit of that age when you're looking at it. Now,
Do you think you can see a difference in terms of what you're going to feel on your palate in the wine?
I
I don't,
do.
maybe that's just romance, but I feel like it has a slightly different viscosity in the glass than a 12% Valpolicella.
Absolutely. I agree. No, it's sticking. This would be
Mm,
harder for people to see.
yeah.
Sticking more, and some of those legs or tears are coming down much slower. So yeah, I agree with you. I think that's
Yeah.
gonna
And
give us a
we're
hint.
15% alcohol on the label.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it gives us a sense of alcohol and body. Now, on the nose, so it's not all primary. I think it's starting to get into tertiary. I'm interested to see if you agree, but not overly so. I think we're definitely starting to get into some of the sort of meaty tobacco, a
Mm,
little bit of wet earth notes, but I still get a lot of like blueberries, ripe plums. There's a lot of baking spices on the nose
indeed.
here.
I like to tell people you can usually pull out any of their red wine descriptors. And if you sniff and swirl long enough, you're probably going to find something along those lines in there. But for me, fruit wise, cherry is, sour cherries, the catch-all for Italian reds, Sangiovese. But I think that maybe even more so with Corvina, maybe less of a sour cherry. And then a great tasting is the Bonacosta, the Campofurine, the Costa Serra, and seeing that cherry evolve or change through the wines with a degree of appassimento. I agree, there's mostly primary. And for me, the main food note is a cherry, but getting into some dried cherries or some confit or even cherry spirit, Kirsch or something like that.
Right.
The maraschino cherries that people put in their Manhattans. If you taste one of those or the syrup that's in those jars, that's if
Oh,
I get that in here.
yeah, very nice.
But definitely the plum and evolving into some fig and some prunes, some dried plums and prunes, so some desiccated fruit as well, which makes sense given that you're drying the grapes before fermentation.
Yeah, very nice. Okay, shall we take a sip?
Please.
We went silent there for a moment if you're listening and not watching. It's because 'cause we're sipping. Oh my gosh, the acidity, beautiful acidity. It's going and going. It's
Right?
such a long finish.
Yeah, that's something I love, and I think is a signature of the Masi style is the acidity and the freshness of these wines that I think can risk running a bit heavy, a bit don't want to say cloying, but with the Passamento, you're concentrating a lot and you still want to have that freshness and drinkability at the end of that. And a big part of that story, I think, is the Molinara. We haven't gotten too much into the grape varieties, but Mazzi's using three or the blend here. It's actually the same as the blend for Campo and Bonacosta. 70% Corvina, 25% Rondinello, and then 5% of a grape called Molinara. And Molinari used to be required in the Valpolicella and Amarone regulation. It was removed, so it's no longer required. But Mazzi is a very big believer in what just even that 5% Molinara brings to the table in terms of freshness. It's a higher acid grape. If you taste it, if you remember tasting it on its own, it doesn't do a ton for you as a single varietal, but it does bring a lot of acid freshness, a little peppery spice as well. That I think is a big part of the Masi style and helps with the drinkability now, but also the aging evolution.
And the tannins, I mean, they're smooth, they're
Mm,
fine, right? They're there,
indeed.
but
Yeah.
they're not getting in the way of the
No.
wine experience at all. And I have to say for a wine that has undergone, as you were just saying, a passamento, in other words, having the grapes been dried and then building up that flavor, building up the profile, it doesn't have weight. It feels really light in the mouth, but very concentrated from a flavor perspective. It almost reminds me, for listeners who are thinking about analogous wines, it's almost like a really great Shiraz, almost like it's got that really concentrated fruit flavor and definitely a lot of cherry on the palate. Very primary still on the
Mm.
palate. So, how long could this wine keep, do you think, Andrew, if someone bought it?
Under the right conditions, I would very confidently say 20, 25 years. Absolutely. Yeah.
Wow.
Tasted Amarone older than that, that often seem like they could use another 20 years. Like it's a surprisingly ageable wine. One you don't hear a ton about older vintages, but we have access to some and we've done some tastings getting back into the 80s and they're still drinking really beautifully.
That's amazing at that price point too, right? It's, I think, a
Absolutely.
$50 bottle at the LCBO here in
Yeah,
Ontario.
currently also available in the half bottles, which is fun. Those are just about half the price as well. But if you're a wine student or on your own, it's a great way to taste one of the great wines of Italy without blowing the bank too much.
No, absolutely gorgeous. And you know what? I have to say, I was just double checking the bottle while you were talking. You had mentioned earlier, but I wanted to double check because I don't taste 15% alcohol here. I don't
No,
smell 15%
no.
alcohol. So I always have to do my little plug being Indian myself. I always look for wines that I think pair well with Asian cuisine that
Mhm.
is meat based, has all of those earthy spices, and is spicy. Because a lot of times people will talk about sweeter wines for
Right,
those types of dishes, and they'll say avoid high alcohol because it's going to make
right.
the food taste more spicy. I think in this case, if you had a traditional Indian meat curry, like I wouldn't go to a vindaloo, it's too expensive,
Okay.
not too expensive, sorry, too
Spicy.
spicy, but a lamb-based dish with a lot of cumin, coriander, and you want something that's got the weight and structure. There's a bit of sweetness on the palate here that's gonna offset some of those flavors really nicely.
Absolutely.
I think this is a beautiful wine for some traditional Asian dishes.
I would agree for sure. Yeah, it's residual sugar is at around 9 grams per liter. So it's a dry wine, but it's not bone dry like Campoferians, 2 grams per liter. Another wine that does really well with spicy foods, but I agree that a little sort of hiss of sweetness. It's still a dry wine, but I think plays really well with a little bit of heat for sure.
Yeah, and as we said, I'm going back to my brisket recommendation.
Yeah,
This would be amazing with brisket.
I don't know. It's a beautiful, yeah, especially the sauce echoed some of the fruit notes. That's a great idea. Yeah. So back to the food pairings. Now you're right. Like steak, but Southern barbecue is
Yes,
a category that works really well with this style.
even a really nice barbecued chicken. All right, listen, Andrew, thank you so much. That was really informative, and I loved tasting that wine with you. That was fantastic. And I hope that people have not only learned a little bit about Masi, which I think is a fantastic and very iconic producer, certainly for the Veneto region and here where I live in Toronto, in Canada. but also had the opportunity to learn from you about Italian wines, about wines from the Veneto, about food and wine pairing. It's just been a really fantastic discussion, and I want to thank you for your time. I hope we can hang out again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Anshu, for having me on. It's been fun to chat, and yeah, look forward to the next one. Maybe a full flight of Amarones. We'll
We'll
go
just,
deep into some back vintages.
we'll just do a tasting. That's all we'll do.
Yes, and the Reciolos too.
Sounds good to me.
Okay.